Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm here with Loki, my faithful assistant, and he and I are going to talk about Scott Joplin, aren't we, Loki? I'm going to do most of the talking and Loki's going to look at the camera. The reason we're looking at Joplin today is mainly because on Monday, the 24th of November 2024, is the official birthday of Scott Joplin and his 156th birthday. So happy birthday to Scott Joplin. I've always loved Scott Joplin's music. I've never discussed it on the channel, but now I'm going to. When I was growing up, I suppose it was the era, the decade of films like The Sting, and Joplin's music became enormously popular. And it was a sort of revival, almost like the Mahler revival of the similar period, but for different reasons. So Joplin's music was pretty much forgotten about after his tragic early death in 1917 when he was 48. He'd had syphilis, which took a terrible toll on his physical and mental health in the last decade of his life. And he'd had a hard life anyway. His father was a former slave, and Joplin, like his dad, had to begin his career working on the railroads, so he was, hard manual labor. But his mother had fostered an early musical talent, and he began by playing cornet, bugle, violin, banjo, and eventually piano. So, amazing, really. Gradually, I think, mainly teaching himself. He was never a particularly skilled pianist, but he did learn the instrument. And I think a lot of his more sophisticated skills as a musician were fostered in his teenage years by, and this is quite a surprising conjunction, a German Jewish teacher who happened to be living in Joplin's hometown of Texarkana in Texas, and at some point had encountered this boy and realised that he had musical gifts, and to his great credit gave Joplin free lessons. So he was sufficiently impressed by him to give him lessons for free and introduced Joplin to aspects of European sort of high culture. And we don't really know what that would have been, but presumably he may have introduced him to piano pieces by composers like Schumann or Beethoven or Chopin, or Brahms even. It's hard to know exactly what that repertoire would have been. Although I just have a little hunch that Joplin must have been aware of Schubert, because his harmony often makes use of these lovely German sixth progressions. This isn't a German sixth, but it's the sort of thing is in the this sort of thing, either that side of the tonic or that side of the tonic. It's sort of the harmony that connects back to composers like Schubert, the great early romantic harmonic vocabulary of the 19th century. But of course, in Joplin's hands, it becomes this beautiful thing and unique in a way, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So I've probably said enough about Joplin's background, a background in which a young, talented musician is trying to make his way in an environment where, people like Joplin were oppressed economically and socially, and he was facing, the kind of racism that black people faced in the late 19th century in America. And yet he gradually forged a career for himself. He was also living a kind of, his whole career is sort of a fairly itinerant musician's life. In his early career, he was playing in little bands that often performed in either churches or brothels, as far as I can work out. Later on, when he had a more established career, he lived for a period in St. Louis and later in New York. And the end of his career was blighted. I mentioned syphilis, but also his determination to try to produce an opera called Tremonisha. And it was sort of a tragic story because in his sterling efforts to try and get the piece put on, he tried to raise funds to do it and eventually did perform it in Harlem, but without success. It was not a successful performance and it was not well received critically. But that whole project with the opera tells you something about Joplin's sensibilities. He was somebody who wanted to reconcile the popular style which he was part of, the ragtime tradition, of which he was not only a pioneer but the leading figure, and a sort of classical sensibility, which I guess he'd inherited from his teacher Julius Weiss, this idea that he wanted ragtime itself to be a kind of classical music, and therefore an elevated, artistic kind of product, not the commercial venture that he was being encouraged to be part of when he was a young composer, but seriously seeking to produce something artistic. And in that respect, I suppose he resembles later 20th century musicians who had a similar intention. George Gershwin, for example, or Duke Ellington. So later musicians who also had a desire to bring their genre, the popular art form in which they were operating, into a more serious, more artistic domain. And you can certainly see that with Joplin too. So the great moment, the defining career break of Joplin's career was in 1899. Very important year in music, 1899. It's also the year when Schoenberg wrote Begleiternacht, and I want to do a video about that at some point. But 1899 was the year when Scott Joplin wrote The Maple Leaf Rag. And The Maple Leaf Rag was a piece that he managed to get published, but he sold most of the rights. I think he retained 1% of the royalties. And because it was an enormous hit, that meant that he did have a relatively a modest income from that one piece for the rest of his life. But the Maple Leaf Rag was an enormous hit. I believe it was the biggest selling sheet music of all American compositions up to that time. So an enormous hit. Maple Leaf Rag, which I will do at some point, probably on this channel, because it's marvellous. And I've loved it since I was about 12. Just discovering these wonderful these wonderful syncopated rhythms of Joplin's, coupled with, there's something else that's really cool in this music, which is this rather resonant, there's a kind of sonorous pianistic style that he develops with these beautifully spaced chords, and everything's so well structured. You know, there's more to Joplin than just the fact that it has ragtime elements. There's something beautiful about the piano writing. As I said earlier, he wasn't actually a particularly good pianist, but that isn't reflected in the piano writing. The piano writing is really imaginative. And the great moment, and I always remember this as a teenager, just because I bought, I don't know if I was a teenager, if I was 12 or something, but I remember buying the sheet music, and the trio section of the Maple Leaf Rag was missing for some reason. So it seemed as if it had this, it did that, and I didn't realise until later that is the anacrusis to the wonderful trio section. So anyway, that's my background to the Maple Leaf Rag. But the Maple Leaf Rag is a wonderful piece, and completely, it's one of these popular works whose reputation and immediate success is completely understandable. You know, sometimes nowadays you can hear the most popular track in the world can be, frankly, quite bland and boring. Not always, but very often. Bland, boring and industrial. But I don't think that's the case with Joplin at all. It was marvellous, and I think it was a big hit because it was new and fresh and exciting. And the idiom derives in some respect from the idiom of the American march. I think Joplin knew this, particularly the kind of popular marches of people like Sousa that were very popular at that time. And in fact, there is a very, very early recording of the Maple Leaf Rag played by the American Marine Corps Band. I think that's from about 1900. So it was initially played as a sort of march type piece. But of course it's got these wonderful rhythms. And why is that? The reason, I guess, for the emergence of ragtime, I mean, Joplin said that when he was growing up, there was a ragtime style around him. And that would imply that the syncopated idiom was simply part of the music of black Americans in the 19th century. In other words, the polyrhythmic kind of syncopations that you found in the popular idioms of that period derived probably from the kind of music that came from African genres. The wonderful polyrhythmic music of Ghana and places like that would have come over with the slaves and become part of the popular music of the late 19th century. So you've got this wonderful rhythmic, fresh rhythmic vocabulary, which absolutely not only rejuvenated the musical idiom of that period, but then went on into the 20th century to rejuvenate musical idioms throughout the 20th century. I mean, this is an amazing thing, the moment when African rhythm sort of becomes part of European and American popular styles. And, you know, significant composers like Stravinsky and Ravel encountered these rhythms in the 1910s and were completely blown over. You know, Stravinsky wrote a piece called Ragtime in 1918 and said, you know, it was fantastic to encounter these idioms. He said that sheet music for ragtimes was brought to him by a conductor called Ernest Ansermet. Although he later realised that when you heard these things in performance, it was even more exciting than the notated version. So I think what Stravinsky realised at that point was that the notation differed from the performance practice. And this is something I'll talk about at the end, is how do we play these pieces? Do we play them straight, like Joshua Rifkind famously did in the 1970s? Or should we be playing it in a slightly more swung way? Well, okay, let me talk now about the Maple Leaf Rag, but the piece that I'm actually going to play isn't the Maple Leaf Rag. It's a later rag from 1907 called Gladiolus Rag. And I'm playing it because in some ways it's a more sophisticated piece. It's a beautiful, rather melancholy piece, and I think actually the essence of Joplin's style is rather melancholy. There's a sort of a wistful character that comes through. And it's never more so than in Gladiolus. But the interesting thing is that the Maple Leaf Rag, this huge hit of 1899, became a kind of model for hundreds of imitation pieces by other ragtime composers. So what you would do is you would take the harmonic template and the structure of the Maple Leaf Rag, and you'd build a new rag based on that structure. And you can also hear in the improvisations of later people like Jelly Roll Morton, when he performs the Maple Leaf Rag, he kind of just improvises on the harmonic framework. That's what the Maple Leaf Rag gradually became, a sort of template for hundreds of imitations. And Joplin himself then felt obliged, it seems, to also follow the template. So you'll see, in a sense, Gladiolus Rag is a sort of variation on the Maple Leaf Rag. So I'll show you what that means. In the Maple Leaf Rag, which is in A flat major, so you have all that. Then you have the arpeggiated minor figure that goes up the piano, and then the little syncopated conclusion, which repeats an octave below. In Gladiolus, it's very, very similar. So that is a much more sophisticated, rather lyrical version of, do you see, a repeating phrase? It's basically the same thing, but more beautiful. And so let me carry on, because from the second phrase, this progression is rather lovely, the chromaticism, the chromatic approach to the dominant. And then where the original, in the Maple Leaf Rag, you then get, and then the arpeggios, the minor arpeggios. In the Gladiolus Rag, you have this. And then the arpeggios, but in F minor, rising up, and then exactly the same kind of shape with the syncopated sort of final phrase. So you can see that he's following the same kind of template. Also interesting, this kind of thing, that sort of double appoggiatura to the dominant is very similar to the kind of thing you'll find in Sousa. I mean, I think there's a funny little passage in the Stars and Stripes March, which has that kind of formula. So what we're looking at here are various tropes of popular style that are being used in various rather imaginative ways. And in Gladiolus, in such a lyrical way that it becomes... in Gladiolus Rag, it's as if he's transformed the various tropes of the popular style into something expressive and original, and really not like the much more kind of upbeat, jolly kind of thing that you would have heard in other composers' work, including Sousa's at that time, and also in other ragtime pieces. This is a much more pensive style. And then, okay, so following the Maple Leaf Rag template, because the next strain of the rag is... Come on, Loki. So let's compare the next strain of the rag with the Maple Leaf Rag. So what he did in the second strain, each strain is 16 bars long, just like a Sousa march. So he had this wonderful, famous ba ba ba, these lovely threes in the time of two. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2. It's that rhythm. Fantastic. In the Gladiolus Rag, he doesn't use quite such a sophisticated polyrhythm, but he has a lovely, is exactly the same harmonic structure and a more expressive melodic line in the right hand. And then it repeats again. But the second time, fantastic rhythm there, isn't it? These lovely offbeat accents, and then the turn from D flat through the minor and then back to the second inversion of A flat. Beautiful. Then, just like in the Maple Leaf Rag, we go back to the main theme. For the last time, it's very interesting, but in these ragtime structures, you have the main theme, then you have the 16-bar second strain, return to the main theme, so you can say it's A, B, A. And then you go to C. C is usually in the subdominant, so in this case it's in D flat major. And then in the Maple Leaf Rag, you come back to the tonic again at the end, but in a kind of D. So you don't go back to the main theme, you have a new thing. So in the Maple Leaf Rag, we get this. And then it's D flat major. And then in the final section, he comes back to A flat from D flat. So D flat, and then there's A flat. But this never comes back. So it's in itself, there's a kind of structural sophistication here in that you have a return to the home key, but you don't have a return to the main tune. There's an awareness in the popular style that it's over repetitive to simply just come back to the main tune. So you kind of forget about the main tune and you, in effect, transcend it with this lovely coda, which is often the best bit. So in this piece, that's exactly what happens. So we step up, the equivalent of that bit, the Maple Leaf Rag middle section, is this. It's this lovely D flat thing, quite hard to play with lots of double octaves. Now look at this amazing harmonic sophistication here. Isn't that fantastic? So you got this lovely, what I would call a lament bass, just a falling music. And then back to the main theme, slightly different this time. And this sort of tragic turn. Or at least, perhaps not tragic, but absolutely, there's something sad about that, isn't there? And very touching, I think. And then we go into the final section, which is perhaps the climax of the piece, where he really lets rip with this lovely polyrhythm. 1, 2, 3, 1. Well, I'll play it to you. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's that rhythm, isn't it? Look at that lovely, almost Wagnerian turn there. The use of these very sophisticated, really romantic. You know, I mentioned about Julius Weiss and the way that he introduced to Joplin the European early romantic harmonic idioms. But it seems to me in Joplin you've got this wonderful synthesis of those early romantic German elements with the polyrhythms of Black American popular music. And it's a really wonderful synthesis. And although Joplin is only, in a sense, a ragtime composer, you know, it's just a single small genre with a single, mostly piano-dominated output, it is wonderfully consistent and contains many beautiful pieces, of which I think the Gladiolus Rag is a marvellous example. I mean, it's a really beautiful piece. So a few things to say before you hear the piece. I've actually recorded it earlier, and I have to warn you that Loki, for some reason, undertook to do a little dance during the performance, and that's just to warn you that he does move around a little bit during the performance, but it's quite entertaining, I think. So he's moved by Joplin's music to the extent that he does his own little performance. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that in this performance, I guess I wanted to break out of that sort of classical way of playing Joplin, as in simply playing it straight, as notated. So some of the sections I do play relatively straight, as Joplin has notated it. But I'm aware, because Joplin lived for some of his life in St. Louis, that a tradition, and I can't tell you when it emerged in St. Louis, but I suspect it existed when Joplin was there. Certainly there is a tradition of St. Louis swing, a very specific swing, and you can hear it in a recording that Jelly Roll Morton did in the 1920s, admittedly after Joplin's death, but there it is, it's clear to hear. I don't think that it's unstylistic to apply an element of swing to Joplin's Ragtime. So on the repeats, and in various places where it just felt nice to do, I've swung it a little bit. I'm sure that some of you will have an opinion on that, and that's fine. But it seems to me that the performance tradition of Ragtime, whatever it is, there is room to consider various approaches, because Ragtime, after all, is in a sense the precursor of jazz. So out of Ragtime emerged this amazing improvised tradition. And it seems to me very likely that the genre itself would have been an improvised genre way back at the turn of the 20th century. It's simply that we don't have any recorded examples, but I think that this sort of thing was going on. When Joplin lived in St. Louis, there was a highly competitive culture of ragtime pianists, and Joplin himself was intimidated by it, because he'd go to these nightclubs and places, play the piano, he'd play the maple leaf rag quite frequently, and then find that other pianists would come along, also play the maple leaf rag, but play it better, and play it with more virtuosity or with more sort of grandiose kind of improvisational elements, and possibly with St. Louis swing attached. So all these things, I think, would have been part of the improvisational culture that was around at the turn of the 20th century, but we don't have any recorded examples, so I'm just speculating and applying an element of that thinking to the performance. So here we go. This is Gladiolus Rag, a masterpiece, I would say, by Scott Joplin from 1907. Enjoy.
Thank you.